Welcome to the Claus YouTube channel.
Together, we strive for a safer, secure, and more stable world.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Strategic Frontlines, Center for Land Warfare's podcast series on concerning India and the world. I'm Ashuman, Associate Fellow at CLOSE, and with me is Professor Sriparna Pathak and Doku Nagamaleshwar Rao. First, let me introduce our guest today. Dr. Pathak is a professor of China Studies at Opijindal Global University and also the director for China Studies at the Council for Strategic Affairs in Washington. Apart from that, she has also been my professor, and the passion that I have for China Studies was ignited by her only. So all thanks to her. And today we bring you a very relevant and interesting podcast of current dynamics in India-China relations. Since October last year, after 4 year almost cold relations, we saw a thaw building up in India-China relations with the petroling agreement, and now it is going up and up. So, ma'am, to begin with, your overview on that, please. Yeah, you're on your.
Thank you, Ashu. And it's always wonderful to speak to you. And Clause is something which I look forward to for inspiration. A few quick points to begin with. Just a basic overview of the India China border dynamics, which forms a very crucial point of India China relations. And there have been certain halting steps towards normalization. But here's the sobering truth: despite years of diplomatic maneuvering, these efforts have largely proven futile. They've been trapped in a cycle of promises without lasting progress. The LSE is 3,488 kilometers of unmarked frontiers. That remains a flashpoint of mistrust and military posturing, where words at the table rarely translate to peace on the ground. But yes, since last year, there has been disengagement, but the disengagement has been in two areas. Given the geopolitical winds right now, we see a lot of different sorts of diplomatic posturing as well. Wang Yi is supposed to visit India. There's supposed to be a resumption of flights and so on. But that doesn't change the current reality along the LSE. So the situation is far from resolved. And, while the attempts still remain at reducing conflicts tend to keep happening between India and China in a cyclical fashion. 2020 was not the first time when the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, attacked India. There have been multiple examples across history. So it's not happened the first time. Again, it's not going to be the last time. So I'll just stop here and then reserve my further comments when you pose questions. Thank you.
Yes, you said there's a cyclical attacks from China on India at the LSE. So if we see since 2013 when she took over, there has been an uptick of incidents at the LSE. Before that, it was largely for 2 decades. It was calm, almost calm. But there were issues, but it was calm. But starting in 2003, it's first started with Depsang, then it went on to Chumar, then it went out to Shipkila, and then to the eastern sector. So there has been a sudden uptick, like, and then we had Doklam and more recently Galwan, and even after that they tried in Yangtze. So
Yeah.
why is that happening? For the last 10 years, why has China become so aggressive against this?
See, it's cyclical completely, but there has to be certain connection to realpolitik, right? If you just look at our eastern sector, till before, say, the 2000s, China was not claiming it as southern Tibet or Zhangnan. Why is it that since then they have been claiming it? Because China's power, or at least display of it, has increased diplomatically. There was the 2008 Olympics and so on, right? That is one issue. As China's power grows more and more, it will want more territory. India is not the only case. There are multiple other countries. You will see Philippines. The 9 dash line becomes a 10 dash line. Similarly, on India, earlier it was just the claims were the loudest in the western sector, but now they've increased in the eastern sector. So as China's power grows, This will keep happening again and again. The fact is that they want Tibet, of course, which is why they're obliterating the identity of Tibet as well, even in terms of nomenclature, now calling it Xizang, doing all sorts of things, naming places within India's territory. Here's the thing, even if, say, heavens forbid, we were to give up the sovereignty of these two disputed territories, it's not going to end over there. Because just the way, now Galwan has emerged. Where was Galwan? China never really officially claimed Galwan, but then it happened, right? So as it keeps growing more and more, as its military power increases, there will be more such incidents. It's just going to keep increasing because China's power militarily, economically, okay, I have doubts on that, but that's just going to keep increasing. And there's a saying in Chinese which translates into one mountain cannot have two tigers, right? If China has to be the hegemon and replace the US as the leading actor of the international system, it first has to ensure there is regional hegemony. The region that China is in is Asia. And fortunately or unfortunately, India is also in Asia. Now, there is one country within Asia which has all the potentials to, well, be as economically powerful as China and so on. Yes, it's a democracy and the world's largest one, which is why things are a bit slow. But the thing is, there is a huge potential that there'll be two tigers within Asia. So even culturally, when there is an emerging tiger or an emerging threat, what do? Curtail it, right? The best way to curtail India's economic rise is to ensure India has to keep pumping in more resources, economic resources, in stabilizing the borders. That's just going to increase in the near future. So that's the unfortunate and pessimistic truth.
Yeah. So coming back to normalization and Wangi. So from a security standpoint, are there any risk of normalization? We see de-induction of troops has taken place at Depsang and Demchok. Before that, at Chumar and Hot Springs, it already took place before 2022. But de-escalation is still to take place. So and our stand after Galwan was that until we reach the pre 2020 status quo, there will be no normalization of ties. But although standoffs are gone now, but de-escalation is still to take place. So, what are the risks of this normalization towards China?
There are, see, this normalization is never really going to be a sort of true normalization because, as you correctly pointed out, de-escalation is yet to happen, right? So, that's not going to happen. Geopolitical winds are again changing. And just to give you an example, even yesterday it was reported that China is now creating this Xinjiang Tibet railway, and that's too close to India's borders. That's a red flag. This company, the Xinjiang Tibet Railway Company, it was formally registered in August 2025. You see the coincidence? As Trump's tariffs and as his rants increase against India, the attempt from the PRC is to showcase a normalization. But it's not really a normalization because the border infrastructure from China on India's borders keeps increasing. So it's a there are two ways. There are two things which China is doing simultaneously: placate India, talk about normalization, talk about de-escalation, whereas not actually fulfilling it, while preparing further to encroach into India's sovereign territory. So that's not the only example. There was, earlier this year also, the dams have been reported on, and so on. So unfortunately, right now, the situation that India is in, wherein, a strategic and trusted partner is now behaving exactly like China, is behaving like a revisionist world power. China would want India in its quarters because it has its own tirade with the US. Having India in its quarter means a lot to it, which is why it'll keep doing this sort of a signaling, right? And the opportunity, the current timings are very, very apt for the PRC. So, but that being said, the question still remains: does India really trust? When we say normalization, again, I think we've been reiterating that there has to be de-escalation. That hasn't really happened. So, which is why the trust factor is nil. It's not really happening. It hasn't happened yet. Wang Yi is coming. See, these sorts of diplomatic maneuvering will keep happening. That's why diplomacy exists. But over and above that, are there real changes happening on the ground? It's not really happening, because it's a tug of war between trust and tactics. Again, India has its own tactics, China has its tactics, so which includes this sort of diplomatic signaling to the West, to the US, and then there is a lack of trust. So the path to normalization, even though it may be paved with good intention, it is littered with failures. These efforts have been futile so far. There's no real de escalation which has happened. There have been endless meetings without resolution. Infrastructure races undermine agreements. It's a persistent shadow of mistrust. And if China really wants true progress with India, it needs to engage in verifiable actions, not just words. Only then can we move beyond this impasse. But that's never happened in the past, and I doubt it's going to be happening anytime soon, if at all.
So, you name some geopolitical the geopolitical reasons behind it. Are there any economic compulsions that China or India has that's leading to a sort of normalization, or at least exchanges between the two?
Right. So, see, even in Depsang and Demchok, we were spending crores of rupees in just ensuring stability, because ensuring that the periphery remains stable takes a lot of money, right? So, there was a need from our side as well. For China, wherein there are economic reasons, because for the Chinese economy right now, finding lucrative markets is very important, because in the past, at least till before, let's say, July or August this year, there were all sorts of signals from the West that there are more clampdowns on the on China, which is why chips were banned and so on, even under the Biden administration. Similarly for the EU. So which economy can absorb those sorts of Chinese exports, right? That would be India's market, because fastest growing major economy. So if it needs the market, it also needs to listen to some of the concerns of India. Whether it fulfills it or not, 100%, that's another thing, because the PRC has been a master of deception. So, because it needs the Indian market, it would throw these tidbits in the form of disengagement in just two areas, and then talk about, look, our patrolling rights are still not restored, and then try to signal that, look, there's a warming up of ties. So, on one hand, it's a signaling also to the US that we have your trusted partner in our quarters now. On the other hand, it's also deceiving India that, look, we want to explore your market. Economic ties are great; they lead to great benefits and so on. But is it actually doing any of it? Is it listening to India's sovereignty concerns? It is not.
So, going back to SR level talks, Doku, do you have some questions? You're on mute.
Yeah, Dr. Shubhana, you're saying, yeah, unmute. Yeah, Dr. Shubhana, you're talking about the failure of CVMs and communication protocols in the past. Uh, since we're talking about the SR level talks, which Wang Yi is uh, visiting next week, uh, do you think this visit is just uh, kind of optics for China for the SEO summit, or is there anything um, that can come out of this meeting?
Ashu, was it a question to me? I lost the
Yes,
internet
sir.
for a second.
Okay.
Yeah.
Should I repeat the question?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
So he asked that why do you think that Wang Yi's visit has been timed for this particular moment, and what signals Beijing is trying to send, since there is a breakdown of CBMs that were established in 93, 96, or in 2005 or 13. There has been a complete breakdown of CBMs during Galwan. So, what signal are they trying to send, given that SCO is in a few weeks and the PM is also visiting? So, is it just a symbolic visit, or do they have any specific things that they want to achieve?
Hmm. Very interesting question. But see, if we really need to understand where this is headed to, we'll have to look back a bit in history, right? These SR talks established in 2003 as a high-level mechanism, in India represented by our NSA Ajit Doval and in China represented by Wang Yi, tries to address the border or the boundary question. They've played a limited role in resolving the line of actual control standoff, which actually erupted in 2020. They've given all sorts of political, strategic guidance. They've helped in building momentum for de escalation. But momentum doesn't translate into de escalation, right? And the actual progress and on disengagement, on de-escalation, proposed de-escalation, it's primarily come from lower level military commander talks and working mechanism for consultation and coordination.
Look at this.
Ram, yeah, you can.
Sorry for the background disturbance. Okay, so as of August 2025, the SR process, it aims to contribute to a partial stabilization, but look, it's not fundamentally resolved the standoff or advanced a comprehensive boundary settlement. Because there's ongoing distrust, right? Here's the thing. Now, given that India's strategic partner, the US, has been, aiming at India, treating friends, partners, enemies, allies in just the exact same way, there's a problem, right? And China understands that there's a India-US relations have come under extreme stress. So what do you do when there is extreme stress from one quarter? Unfortunately, the global race for the position of the hegemon is between the US and China, right? So you will need as many partners as possible. Now, the assumption here is that given that the strategic partnership between India and US is under this extreme strain right now, India could possibly be placated. So, which is why showcase or send out these signals, right? He will come. He's come earlier also in the past, but it's not led to anything substantial. The problem still remains. These are optics and these are signaling, but over and above that, I honestly don't expect anything substantial to come out of this.
You're on mute.
Yeah. You're talking about the optics of summits, and the next year, India will also be hosting BRICS Summit, and we have G20 and the SEO. But most of the time, when you see China and India, both are competing for a kind of get a goodwill from the global south, using the potential of both the Indian economy and Chinese economy. Uh, do you, do you think this global south solidarity narrative is strong enough to override some of the strategic competition between the major powers of the global south?
Okay. Basically, just I'm sorry, there's some internet disruptions going on. Just to reiterate, are the global south mechanisms good enough to resolve some of these outstanding issues, right? If I heard it correctly, could one of you please confirm?
No, ma'am. My question was about there is a kind of competition between China and India to get a goodwill from the global south.
Right.
When these two countries are the major drivers of the global south economic momentum, uh, will the bilateral rivalry affect their individual global south initiatives?
Right. Again, very interesting question. Look, again, in the global south, it's a very potent grouping, of course, because, the West, unfortunately, has been extremely hypocritical. And let's not even go into how countries of the global south, including China, have been colonized and exploited in the past. But yet there's all sorts of expectations from global south countries to, do their bits and take the world economy forward and do all those nice rosy things without any sort of responsibility from the global north. That's one thing. So there is a very potent force now called the global south. And China understands that India has a very important role, if not the most important one. Because even within the global south, if, say, China wants to claim the leadership, how much credibility does it really have, right? Because a lot of global south countries, again, unfortunately, have also been subjected to resource strain or weaponization of trade. And that happens from China, right? That hasn't happened yet from India, which is why India has a better credibility. So for China, that's also a threat. Does India see it as a threat? Not really, because Vasudeva Kutumbakam is the driving force. Just to give you exact examples of how this is a concern for China, India's position in the global south, let me take you back to when India had the presidency of the G20. And the theme was Vasudeva Kutumbakam, decided by India, and that was the theme of the G20. And China raised an issue saying that the theme is in Sanskrit and Sanskrit is not a UN language. Here's the problem: G20 is not the UN. So one cannot wrap one's head around the fact that why would China even raise this unless it wants to curtail India and its voice and its theme. There is no other explanation for this. That's one thing. During G20, Putin didn't come because, as he said, there's a war unfolding and he had to be there and so on. He gave a reason. Xi Jinping also didn't come for the G20, but he didn't give a reason, right? Why would you not come for the G20, right? Because India and US were assumed to steal the show, which India did anyways. So that's another issue. Here's the third thing. When the G20 was going to happen, there were scores of disinformation handles from the PRC, which were churning out narratives of how India's arrangements for the G20 are subpar, whereas that's anything but true, right? There were lots of fact checks which were done. So the question again is, why would handles operating from the PRC churn out this disinformation? What is the threat that China has as a global south country from India, right? If that wasn't enough, and all of this is open source information, the delegation which came from the PRC for the G20, there were issues when they were checking into the five-star hotel, which was, for all dignitaries. When the bags were being checked in, then the security cameras beeped, and as per diplomatic protocol, the bags of diplomats cannot be opened, they cannot be checked. So what India asked is that there is some sort of a security concern. So could you disclose what exactly is in it? So they said no. Finally, there was a standoff for quite a few hours. We don't really know what sort of recording devices were there or what exactly was inside. Finally, it got resolved when India said that the bags can be sent to the Chinese embassy, and well, you're free to do whatever you want to in the Chinese embassy. Question here is, why would there be such thwarting attempts? Again, China or the Chinese diplomats, the Chinese envoys who were here for the G20 asked for separate internet connections. It's all encrypted. It's not the first time India is hosting a global event. And if the internet connection for other diplomats is encrypted, adhering to all sorts of protocols, why the demand for separate sorts of internet, right? So China understands, again, even in the global south, that India has a credibility because so far, India has not engaged in the sort of exploitative diplomacy which China engages in. So what do you do that? Thwart India's leadership in the global south again, while projecting global south as a bloc and as to how they want to cooperate with India. But look, facts on the ground don't match the rhetoric. And unfortunately for China, unfortunately for India, the Indian, security establishment understands it. So that's the problem.
So, ma'am, moving on to economy, we discussed that you said that India is a big market, and obviously China would want access to that. Now, coming on to this India, US, China triangle, we are seeing trade friction between India and US.
Ashu, I can't hear you with your background noise.
Just a second. I'll just be back. Yeah, am I clear now?
Yes, I can hear you.
So we discuss about trade. We So India is a consumption-based economy. China is a export-based economy, and you rightly said that we are a huge consumption market, and China would obviously want access to that, right? So and similarly, US, although there are trade frictions between us, who knows what's going to happen in 3 months, and we might reach a deal, and that may lead to the end of it. So how does the US-China trade friction, Trump's tariffs on India, indirectly shapes India-China economic relations?
Okay, so see, there's the shadow of escalating US China trade frictions, although one doesn't really know what the US wants to do, what the US wants to do with regards to China, because currently, in the last 2 weeks, if you see, all his trade policies are actually protecting China. There are not further tariffs on the PRC, despite it being the largest importer of Russian oil and so on, right? The targeting is more of India. But the fact still is that there is an escalating US China trade friction. India's economic dance with China reveals a story which is not of deepening partnership but of calculated maneuvering amidst profound mistrust. Now, as we navigate these global headwinds in 2025, it's very clear that any sort of thaw in India China relations is tactical. It's signaling to Washington for leverage. It's not a foundation of strategic trust, right? Let me unpack this through three lenses. One is the indirect shaping of our bilateral ties, the double edged sword of supply chain shifts, and the barriers which are erected by protectionism. First, US China trade frictions, amplified by Trump's tariffs, they have indirectly shaped India China economic relations by funneling Chinese exports towards India's way as Beijing seeks to have alternatives to the American market. Now, with Trump extending high tariffs on China, now averaging over 34% since his return, Beijing has pivoted, exporting surplus goods to India or partnering with Indian firms to bypass US duties. But then there are Trump's own tariffs on India, which now stand currently at 50%. They've complicated this. India, which was once positioned as America's counterweight to China, now actually faces punitive measures for not curbing Russian oil imports. It's an attempt to force Russia to engage with the US, very unfortunate, but that's how it is, which actually means that India is quite an important player because if the US wants to get Russia to the negotiating table and wants to use India, I don't know where the global order is going. But coming back to India China, right? This isn't trust, it's survival theater. It's rooted still in the 2020 border clashes, and that have shattered any illusions of strategic alignment on diversification of supply chains and trade patterns. Question here is India benefiting or caught in the crossfire? Look, the answer again is a mix of both, right? Because the gains are fleeting, they're fraught, and we'll have to wait and watch what sorts of results we have in the next 1 to 2 years. As multinationals adopt the China plus one strategies amidst US tariffs, India has emerged as a hub, absorbing investments in manufacturing, gaining an edge in 22 export sectors, ranging from textiles to electronics. Our exports to the US have surged, with bilateral trade hitting new highs as there is a shift from China. But this benefit is coming at a cost because increased Chinese dumping actually risks hollowing out domestic industries and so on. Okay. Any outreach to China, therefore, like these recent meetings or the ones which are coming up, these are just temporary signaling to the US. They are not a vote of confidence in Beijing. Finally, protectionism is a problem. Um, Barriers, all these barriers to trade that we now see, again, from China, from the US, they also underscore India's wariness. See, post 2020, India imposed stringent investment curbs from Chinese firms, scrutinizing FDI, and correctly so, banning apps to mitigate security risks. Here's the thing, critical minerals and China's control over it. China's got a stronghold over here. China's 2024 export bans on gallium, on germanium to the US highlighted our vulnerability, prompting India to diversify sources while rejecting deeper reliance on Beijing. Now, China has eased some curbs in deals with the West. What India is exploring internally on rare earth metals and reaching out to other like minded partners, be it Australia, be it Japan, and so on, right? This There's not going to be any sort of real engagement with the PRC. Bilateral trade has grown to $118 billion in financial year 2024, but this hot economics, this actually masks cold politics. No strategic trust, just paradigm hedges against US pressures. US China trade frictions offer India opportunistic gains. They actually reinforce our guarded stance against China. Temporary gestures like border pacts, trade dialogues, these are just signals to the US. They are not bridges of enduring partnership. Because, look, true progress demands trust, which simply doesn't exist. Not in the military domain, not in the political domain, not in the economic domain. So that's what I think. Ashu, you are on mute. Ashu, you're on mute.
Yeah. Coming back to tariffs, ma'am, we India has been on the bad end of the stick, being pushed with 50% tariffs. Initially, China's tariffs went as high as up to 125% when he was increasing and increasing and just saying out random numbers against China. But suddenly, China put some barriers on rare earths that they have complete control over, production, rare earth magnets, and then the trade negotiation started. The initial moratorium of 30 days, then now the joint statement that came after the last round of talks, and then another moratorium of 90 days. So, what does that show? What leverages apart from rare earths does China have that they get a 90-day moratorium from someone like Trump?
See, A is the chokehold that China has, which you correctly pointed out as it's the rare earth metals. Unfortunately, countries across the globe, be it India or the US, we've not built in the past our capabilities on such sort of production. It's not like we don't have rare earth metals, but the fact is we just somehow, all countries, got swayed by this whole idea that, liberal economics will actually prevent any sorts of conflict. But look, here we are. China has now established weaponization of trade or illiberal economics, wherein China can arm twist countries to give in to their political choices and decisions through economic means, right? And there are scores of examples, right? Just one example, I think when Australia, for example, wanted an independent inquiry into the origins of the Wuhan virus, the COVID-19 pandemic, China very smartly said that we will not be importing barley and beef and all those sorts of things from Australia. And Australian economy has a dependence on the PRC, right? So this is a political decision. This is an economic decision. The boundaries between the two somehow get diminished. It's the same sort of thing, even with rare earth metals. And as you saw, they've got a chokehold over Trump-led United States at the moment, which is why they gave in. But there's another reason I want to focus on. Trump's decisions on China, they are not just to do with rare earth metals or etc. I think today also there's been a statement from the US administration which says that even after the 15th August meeting between Putin and Donald Trump, if things don't really go the US way, there'll be more tariffs on India. Like, really, why? Right? One wonders why. I think our MEA has also pointed out the US's hypocrisy when it itself imports humongous amounts of fertilizers from Russia while it targets India for being the second largest importer of oil. China is the largest importer of oil. Why is it that the US won't target China on this? Here's the thing, they understand that the strategic partnership between India and Russia is actually much deeper than the no limits partnership which Russia and China actually have, right? So, which is why when you arm twist India, maybe you can get Russia to bend, bend the knee, right? Maybe that's not really going to happen. Maybe India has to brace for bigger tariffs because Russia is also a sovereign country. And as terrible as the war is, it's a decision which is taken by the Russian leadership. I do not understand how India is being used as a bait in this, right? This has been stated by the US administrations today. That's the real reason. Look, when Trump came to power, he said that he's going to get the war to end. He tried placating Putin as well. Didn't really work out, including 2 times at the UN when the US actually took Russia's side. India doesn't take Russia's side. India abstains. Neither yes nor no. US actually took Russia's side. And that was the beginning of the breakdown of the transatlantic relationship. He wants Russia in his quarter and he wants to showcase that Yeah, he's been able to end the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, Putin is not bending the knee for whatever reasons. That's beyond India's sovereign control. You know, we have our own conflicts going on with the PRC and with Pakistan, which both US and China now support. So the real reason I see is not any economic smartness from the US right now, but it's a more politically calculated and very juvenile move, to be honest, because I don't think Russia bending the knee for protecting India. India has been a strategic partner to the US, and it's a time tested. Russia is a time tested friend, but sovereign decisions can't be bound to this. So unfortunately, after 15th August, I think India should brace for bigger tariffs, and that's how it is at the moment.
Rao, you have some question?
Yeah. Uh, Moving on to the talks that is supposed to happen next week. Like you're talking about the risk trust. Trust cannot be built on the words, but on the results. Uh, and the role of border management and dispute resolutions and mechanisms have been like so far symbolic than what we can see in the results. And the second point that I have is there's a lot of external influence on India-China bilateral talks. Um, right now, it's the U.S. tariffs, and before it was China-U.S. competition and Russia's actions in Ukraine. Uh, in this context, if we have to, not no, we're not in the business of predictions, but if we have to see what are the factors that will
I can't.
I think he disconnected, ma'am. He'll be joining in. We can continue until then. So he wanted to ask about the visit. Like based on the visit, we more likely to see a slow confidence building process or a sharp diplomatic breakthrough between the two? Are there any lessons from previous round of talks? And has gradualism delivered or stalled real change in India-China ties?
Right. See, there's not going to be any real sort of resolution. Talks keep on happening, right? That's why diplomacy exists. The point of diplomacy or confidence building measures is to keep conflicts at bay. But here's the thing: there is humongous amount of build up by the PLA, by the PRC on India's borders. That's not going to go away. So, see, talks will have to keep happening to showcase that we are interested in a relationship. Look, unfortunately, there is a power differential between India and China, and our sovereignty is encroached upon by the PRC, by Pakistan, right? But what do we do over here? War is not a choice for India unless pushed to the extent when India has to defend its sovereignty. We've seen it through Operation Sindoor. We've seen it, when the Indian Army also held its ground against the PLA. Wang Yi will come. There will be more talks. There will be more visits. But um, I don't, even from historical examples, what have talks really led to? The boundary dispute continues. Even this year, what I want to raise through a certain example is the question of intent, right? Does China really want to solve the border dispute with India? This year, when Rajnath Singh ji spoke about resolving the border permanently, he used the term permanent, right? And he called the issue over Tibet, right? What was the response from the PRC? They said that again, this will be decided in future. The time is not ripe yet. It's the exact same thing which was said to India in the 1950s. There's not been a change. What does that really show? No change in response from 1950s onwards to 2025. This means that there is no intent to resolve the boundary dispute. The intent is just to use India in China's whole tirade with the US or with the West, right? Another thing, when there are talks on the border, India talks about resolution. The terms are very important. India talks about resolution. When you see the Chinese statement, the term management is used, border management. Why would you want to manage it? Why would you not want to resolve it? Because there is no intention to resolve. But look, the signaling from China has to keep going on, right? Only then would India play along, which is why these sorts of talks will continue, right? So India has to continue the talks because, well, we are not the ones who always choose war. So we would still want to talk and still find a resolution. But here's the thing, there is no intention from China's side. And that's the unfortunate bit. So it's not, unfortunately, I don't see it getting resolved even this time. China doesn't want to resolve it.
Yes. So when we talk about border resolution, and you rightly said, leaders since 1950, 1949, whether it was Mao, whether it was Zhou Enlai, whether it was Deng Xiaoping, or it was Jiang Zemin, or Hu Jintao, or Xi, they having using the same line that leave the border to the future generation and let's focus on broader ties. So, and on the other hand, we see that China has 14 land neighbors. They have resolved issues borders with 12 neighbors, and that includes big power as big as Russia, or small countries like Nepal, and so on and so forth. So what is the reason that India is a odd one out, let's say, and we have not been able to resolve? Even when we say after Tiananmen Square massacre, in 90s, whatever issues were remaining with the countries in Central Asia or Russia, they resolved the border after that. And there was a give and take approach. In 1990s, we signed two agreements in 93 and 96, but there were no talks about resolving the border. It was about confidence building. So why do you think that even during that time China did not resolve the border?
Very interesting question. I think the answer is in the question itself. Why is it this it's not just India, it's also Bhutan. Why is it that India and Bhutan's territorial disputes with the PRC have not been resolved? If you look at all the resolution of the disputes that the PRC has had with other neighbors, including with Pakistan, by the way, you see that the territory gain has been for the PRC, right? Even for Russia. So India does not want to give up the territory. So because it's sovereignty, right? Be it US, be it China, India does not want to play along. As simple as that. All the benefits which China promised, maybe to Russia, maybe to Central Asia, maybe to so on, other countries and so on, those didn't really appeal to us because our dispute has always, remained with them. Let me give you, just since you mentioned Russia. Okay, let's look at this 1991 Sino-Soviet border agreement, right? Signed in May 16th and so on. This treaty addressed most of the border disputes between China and the Soviet Union. Russia inherited the terms after USSR's dissolution, right? And there were territorial adjustments. China gained approximately 720 kilometers square, including about 209 islands and islets on the Argun River, 902 islands on the Amur River, right? And so on. There's territorial gain. Does India want that? China has suggested in the past as well, that let's have a swap. You keep, because, Aksai Chin, northern sector, eastern sector, let's swap, right? But why should India swap? It's India's sovereign territory. We never claimed anything on Tibet. We could have maybe before Shimla agreement and so on, but we didn't. How much do we give in? Because this is like never ending, right? Even after Tibet, now there is this, since 2000s, particularly after 2008, the screams on Arunachal Pradesh have become Srila. So, okay, Arunachal Pradesh. After that, what? Assam? After that, what? So, this is like going to go on and on. And that goes back to the reason, one of these things which I had spoken about, the strategic culture. One mountain, two tigers, right? Encroach the territory of the potential tiger, right? So, that's the unfortunate bit. Again, going back to Russia, 2004 border demarcation agreement signed between Putin and Chinese President Hu Jintao. That agreement resolved the remaining disputes which couldn't get resolved since 1991. Russia ceded approximately 337 kilometers square, including what the Russians called Bolshoi Ussuriski, what the Chinese call the Hesyadze Island, and roughly say 32 kilometers square islands near the Khabarovsk, what's called in Russian, transferred to China, along with the entirety of Tarabarov, or what the Chinese called Inlong Island. Um, Also, there is the Abagaitu Islet, which is a 5 kilometer square islet on the Argun River, fully transferred to China. Would India do this? It's not acceptable. How much more do we give in? Shimla Agreement, not really signed. Okay, the British and the colonizers created a lot of issues, but why is it that there was a Chinese representative present? But why is it that after the verbal agreements, the treaty never got ratified from the PRC? Question, right? Is India willing to give up that? India is not okay with ceding more territory. How much more do we do this? Right? So that's not going to happen. Other territories, maybe they thought that, yes, there'll be economic advantages to cooperating with China. It's a powerful neighbor. Yes, China is a powerful neighbor. But for India, sovereignty matters. And any sort of economic tidbit is not enough. It cannot buy out India's sovereignty. Maybe it's a mindset problem, or maybe it's just having a spine. So that's what I think.
Now you have some questions.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have no questions, but we have a lot of questions in the chat box. So I'll list out some of the points so you may respond to them. Uh, Akash Krishna, he's looking at the US and China sanctions mostly, and the Operation Sindhu. Within this context, is asking like, does their hegemony stands have a legs or to stand on? And we have other questions from Rajan, and maybe so. There's one question on our title about the handshakes. Should we look into the handshakes, or should we look into the real actions on the ground? Uh, so although the focus would be the media focus would be on the uh, headlines. So what is your response on these two
I'm
issues?
unable to. Can you shorten the question? Also, I'm losing. I'm losing now since Ashu's voice is a bit louder on the screen. Can you just shorten the questions and ask me?
Yes, ma'am, I'll continue. In light of the dynamics of OP Sindur and global after action review with regard to damage to enemy, most relevant nations are left speechless and in distress. Your views on that?
After Operation Sindoor, most nations are left speechless.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, what's the question?
I don't think it has any context. Context will move on to the next one. So the next one says the Chinese economy and demographics are in a steep decline. The same may be said for the USA in lesser measure. Does their hegemon stand have the legs to stand on?
Very interesting question. Yeah, aging population is a humongous problem in the PRC. Because of decades of this one child policy, they've now reached a stage wherein you don't really have adequate laborers or adequate innovators, right? The youth is very less, right? And the burden of taking the economic indices of the country falls on them, which is why you would hear lots of these things like lying flat movement, or the fact that now the youth are not willing to invest in, say, startups, and they would now want to choose something which is less risky, like a stable job, and so on. All sorts of these things are happening. Demographics is an issue which leads to certain economic outcomes, right? Reduction in total fertility rate. We keep hearing this term again and again. The lesser children you have, who's going to take the country forward, right? Currently, fortunately, India has positive demographics, right? Ours is also going to taper off, but not immediately. We have at least 15 more years to go. So here's the thing for the economy, right? So who's going to take the economic indicators forward? Demographics is a problem. in the West, particularly in the US, till before these terrible policies from the US kept coming in, as you would have seen, most of the innovation, even in tech companies, etc., are actually done by Americans of foreign origin, a lot of time of Indian origin, and so on. But now, if Trump wants to, well, destroy that, it's up to the US to decide what it wants, what it really wants from its future. It is a problem, right? India has the positive demographics at the moment. If we can skill our youth adequately, then it works well for India, right? If we can create those opportunities, and a lot of these plannings, etc., are going on. So let's wait and watch for the next 5 years. If unfortunately US in its bid to make America great again actually makes America ungreat again, it's creating space for the PRC to become the hegemon. If the PRC becomes the hegemon, how long can it really sustain? Even if you look militarily, it can't be people above 60 years of age. And I'm just simplifying it to the easiest levels. Can't be them in the army, right? So let's wait and watch. Positive demographics and high TFR have impacts on the societal, political, and economic future of the country. So if both the two of the world's leading actors want to destroy themselves from within, there's nothing much which outsiders can do, because if outsiders comment, then that's interference. So I hope that answers the question.
Ma'am, the next question we have is on the internal dynamics in the party. So the question is that we see that when she came to power, he formed a lot of small leading groups. And recently, those small leading groups usually became central groups, and he was the one who was heading them. But recently, we have been seeing that he has been delegating the chairmanship, or he has been making other people head of those groups, some in the standing committee, some in the larger politburo. So, does this mean that she is taking a step back, or is he losing grip on power, seeing so many purges in the military and even in the CMC?
See, it's Xi Jinping is not going anywhere anytime soon. There have been a lot of these narratives about how Xi Jinping has been ill, he's not been seen, and so on. But look, here's the thing. I think when this narrative was dominating the most, that's exactly the time. The time coincided with Dr. Jaishankar's meeting with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is alive. He's around. There have been a lot of purges recently. Also, 2 weeks back, also there've been purges, which means that she is not willing to cede control. There might be tweaks, there might be changes going on within the domestic political structures, but Xi Jinping is in command. He's in total command. Otherwise, the simplest of things, you would have heard rumblings of who is going to really take over after Xi Jinping. Look, Xi Jinping signifies strongman politics. So, which is why he will do the signaling, even he has to do signaling even to his domestic audience, as draconian as the state might be, but he's not really going anywhere. If you look at just last year, the final months of 2024, they've seen a humongous, like a big wave of purges in Xi Jinping's China, right? The defense ministry last year, it announced the suspension of, say, Admiral Miao Hua, the number 4 military leader before Xi Jinping, who oversaw political organizational work of the PLA. Now, Miao's ouster made him the 3rd PLA general in charge of political and organizational work to get purged, right? Also, the second of the 6 members of the 20th Central Military Commission. So there was an announcement last year in December, which also confirmed the removal of 2 former PLA generals from the National People's Congress. Yo Haitao, who was the former deputy commander of the PLA Ground Force, and Li Pengcheng, the former commissar of the PLA's Southern Theatre Command Navy. If she was really ceding control, he wouldn't be purging these people, right? There are loads and loads of further news articles. You crawl the Chinese cyberspace, you'll find out more about this. There have been more high-ranking PLA officers who have been removed. I think there was a reportage of also Defense Minister Tong Chun, who was under investigation, right? But Tong Chun later on appeared before the public with his official title and so on, right? The thing is, Xi Jinping is in command. He's not going away anytime soon. Otherwise, there would be rumblings, there would be a new name. See, even even before the 20th Party Congress, there were these rumblings that Li Keqiang might just emerge as the contender, because Li Keqiang seemed like more, and I say seemed unfortunately because he's no more. Li Keqiang seemed like the more economically rational person, as opposed to Xi Jinping, who is more of a military in command or politics in command, right? So there were a lot of these signalings or a lot of gestures which Li Keqiang did, laying wreath to the statue of Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping is the architecture of China's reforms and opening up, right? And those sorts of things. But what really happened? Xi Jinping is firmly in control. If anything, Li Keqiang died of a mysterious or some um, not fully disclosed health reasons. He is in command. He's going to stay. Even if, say, heavens forbid, even if, say, something does happen, fortunately or unfortunately, the thing is, it's going to be the CPC in command. That's going to be a permanent. It's not like China's relations with its neighbors or the US were any rosier earlier in the past, not under Mao Zedong, not under Deng Xiaoping, right? Not under Jiang Zemin, not under Hu Jintao. It's going to be CCP. It's CCP ideology. Yes, Xi Jinping is a bit more draconian, is a bit more military in nature, but that's going to stay.
Our final question, man. It's a two-parter. During the 20th Party Congress, we see that before the 2012, there was this collective leadership thing that was going on in the party, and there were various factions. Most probably the Communist Youth League faction or the Shanghai Clique, right? They also had power during Xi's first two terms. But during 20th Party Congress, we saw that those two factions became kind of dormant because all the leaders, the even the premier or everyone, was someone who derived their power from Xi or had worked from Xi for Xi before, thus forming a new faction that we can call this Xi faction. So, are CYL or Shanghai Clique have some say now, or they are completely still dormant?
So, see, the Communist Youth League, or what is called the Tuanpai faction, um, its political influence was significantly diminished because the 20th Party Congress was a pivotal moment in the CCP's leadership restructuring. Xi Jinping consolidated power, secured his third term as the General Secretary, reshaped the Politburo and the Standing Committee, right? And the whole process sidelined key figures associated with the Communist Youth League, which is a faction which is seen historically as a breeding ground for senior CCP leaders, right? First is Li Keqiang, as I mentioned. He was a prominent CYL or Communist Youth League affiliated figure, former premier. He was not elected to the new Central Committee, despite being under the customary retirement age of 68. He stepped down as premier in March 2023. Then there was Wang Wang, who's another associated leader with the CYL. He was former chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. He also failed to secure a spot in the new Central Committee, retired in March 2023. There was Hu Chunhua, a former vice premier, again a key CYL figure, again excluded from the Politburo, despite being elected to the Central Committee. So this again was a significant setback. He was previously considered to be a potential successor to top roles. There were two more people. One was Lu Hao, who was also a CYL affiliated official. He was reassigned to a less influential role as party secretary of the Development Research Center of the State Council before the Congress. And there was Zhou Qiang, who was the former Chief Justice and CYL figure. He also failed to enter the Politburo. So Xi Jinping actually consolidated power, right? His dominance was evident in the appointment of loyalists to the Politburo added to its standing committee. All seven standing committee members have ties to him. Sorry, I was going to say have ties to him. So there's no room for CYL affiliated leaders who were historically associated with Hu Jintao's faction or seen as a counterbalance to Xi Jinping's power. Hu Jintao himself got removed from the Congress's closing ceremony, where he was escorted out reportedly due to health issues, right? Which is widely interpreted as a symbolic humiliation of the CYL faction. So he's just consolidated his power. He's here to stay. So one needs to brace for a continued term of Xi Jinping. And this is what it is. I know I sound very pessimistic, but one needs to always prepare, keeping domestic politics of neighboring countries and powerful ones in mind.
Thank you, ma'am. So, do you have any final closing comments on what will be the future trajectory of our relations with China? Are they supposed to hold? Theoretically, they don't. Like you said, one mountain, two tigers, or hegemony. So, what are your final comments on that?
Final comments is that, look, unfortunately, given the sorts of eccentric theatrics that Trump-led US is engaging in, reduces space for India's maneuvers. That does not mean that India trusts China. But here's the thing. Trump's US is very scared of de-dollarization, right? And what has completely not been taken cognizance of by the US is that even within the BRICS, India held its ground against de-dollarization much before Trump started saying things about it, right? But there's been no cognizance. On the contrary, India has been penalized for heavens really knows what. Maybe because India is actually a power, and other existing powers don't really like having further. It's that simple theory of Thucydides trap, right? No leading hegemon would want another power to emerge. So, okay, that's another story for another day. So India will give all the signals to the West, to the US, because look, it is the West, unfortunately, is very hypocritical. So India can also do the signaling. Let Trump be worried about de-dollarization. Even yesterday, day before yesterday, actually, RBI has taken certain steps to reduce the reliance on the dollar and wants to trade in the rupees, not in the yuan, of course, because that doesn't help us. But yes, if there is a concern over India, Russia, China emerging as a group, so be it. Because when India played by the rules, there was no cognizance of that. So while India will not trust China, cannot, because there's no historical ground for it, China is also preparing additionally, but diplomatic optics, these sorts of things stay. And it's unfortunate that Trump does not read. He calls the world's fastest growing major economy a dead economy. He prioritizes China over India. He prioritizes Pakistan over India. So India will make choices keeping its own national interests in mind, national interests first. So diplomatic posturing, negotiations will happen, but real engagement with China is not happening in the near future.
Rao, do you have something to say?
No,
Okay.
but we had a very insightful discussion, and uh, we are very fortunate to have the um, all of our some of our listeners' questions to be answered, and we encourage our listeners to stay engaged with the Quaz research by exploring articles. And we have two journals, which are Scholar Warrior and Clause Journal, and you can also follow our website and social media. Stay tuned to the next episode of the Strategic Frontline.
So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
On that note, we'll be ending today, but due to paucity of time, a lot of questions couldn't be asked. I think we'll have to have you another time. And thanks a lot. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.